Okay, Mr. Limrad, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Yes.
Very much enjoying being in Jokhyang.
Yes. With rainy season?
Yes, well, that's one disadvantage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Disadvantage.
So I went this Sunday. I went to Merapi.
Merapi, yeah.
Yeah, and when visiting the museum, it was sunshine, and then when going around the volcano, it was raining.
Yeah.
But that's how it works out.
Yeah. Okay, let's start our interview, right?
Yeah,
But
okay.
before we start, could I call you with Bapak?
Oh, yes.
Pak Lindwet?
Oh, but yeah, I think better Pak Thomas.
Pak Thomas, Pak Thomas, yes.
Yeah,
Because
that's what Indonesian students usually call me.
yeah, because Pak it sounds more closer, yeah.
Yeah,
So we as family, like we as family.
yeah,
Like I call Pak Bambang or Mas Wahid like that.
yeah.
Okay, Pak Thomas. When I see your CV, I see that your training record is different from political science, international relationship, and your PhD on economy.
Yeah, on precisely.
So-
Although economic history was the topic of my PhD dissertation and also the topic of my MA, my dissertation, my MA thesis. So I was in the economics faculty, but I was specializing on economic history.
Economic history. So, could you give me a description about economic history?
Well,
A brief description.
yes, well, very simply, it's about its history, but it's focusing on the economy. And some people think that economic history means that you are dealing with numbers and with statistics and not with people. So among some historians, it's less fashionable because they want to talk about people and events. And economic history is much more about processes of things changing and events also to some extent, like, well, for instance, the Asian financial crisis in 1997 was a major economic historical event. And so that's the broadest definition of economic history. It's a kind of history where the economy is playing the major part. And perhaps that's another one more difference with other forms of history is that economic history is likely to use more economic concepts, to use abstract concepts and theory from the science of economics. Yeah.
And if I study economic history, what the advantage with that approach to understand history extensively?
Well, there are some advantages. One advantage is that you will get a better training than many other historians in using social science concepts, in particular from economics, and you will be more focusing on things which are important in contemporary government and also in business. Well, at our university, experience shows that people who studied economic history, who graduate with a major in economic history, they can more easily get a job than the people who are just focusing on history, general history, on political history. And also another striking aspect of economic history, I don't know if it's true for Indonesia, but in my university it appeals more to men than to women. So there are more men in the class than women, And some men think that maybe economic history is too difficult for women. And they make jokes about it, and of course then the women will protest against it.
Yes. Okay, Mr. Pak Thomas.
Yeah.
I ever read some article written by Mr. Thi Kian Huy.
Yeah.
He said that unfortunately many economists have not seen a high interest on economic history. So I suspect that there is no advantage study economic history to economic science itself.
Well, that is true. Well, first of all, I'm glad that you mentioned Pak Thi Kian Huy, who unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago, and he was a very dear friend of mine, and a very good economist who helped a lot of people, both foreign scholars and students, and also Indonesian students. And he was himself an example of an economist who took a great interest in economic history. He never studied history. He studied economics in the United States, but then for his PhD he chose an economic historical topic. But he is right that there is much greater interest among historians for economic history than among economists. And I've had that experience myself, so I can reinforce that. Many years ago, well, maybe you were already born, but it was in the early 1990s. I was teaching a course on economic history at the FAUI, and in fact I was replacing Pak Doro Jatun, who was then very busy as a dean of the Faculty of Economics. And the students were very interested, but they did not want to pursue the interest in economic history after graduation. They wanted to work as economists. They wanted to work for the government in particular. And well, I think that it is well known that FAUI is especially closely connected with the government. And then, of course, there is also the possibility for economists to go into private business. And it is a fact that if you are successful in private business, then you will get more money than when you are teaching economic history. Yes. But economic history is it's a good profession to have a nice life, at least, and to do interesting things, but it is not a way to quickly become rich.
Yes. Can economic history give contribution to economic science?
Yes, I think so, because economists are sometimes too much charmed by the abstract concepts, by the abstract models, and they have a tendency to move away from reality and not to look at the reality, but to just look at their models, and as a result, you get predictions from of all sorts from the economists, and some people say that there is not going to be a crisis. Others say that there's going to be a crisis, and some say you should do this and you should do that, and so it's very difficult to get some kind of consensus. But what has struck me in particular with respect to Indonesian economic history is that the economists abroad, especially in Australia, they know a lot about the Indonesian economy today. They come often to Jakarta and they talk to government officials. They go to Bank Indonesia and they know what's going on in Jakarta, but they have no idea of what happened before the Orde Baru.
Yeah.
And so the Orde Lama, well, that's complete unknown territory, and also the colonial period. So they lack the historical perspective, and that is where the historians can come in. They can give a much better perspective, much better long-term perspective than what you can get if you just apply economic theory and economic concepts. So I think economic historians can contribute to the science of economics, but the economists have to be receptive for it. They have to be willing to understand. And sometimes I've had good experiences with Australian economists, well-known experts on Indonesian economy, and then I took them to a conference of economic history, and they said, well, this is really interesting. I didn't know anything of this.
Yeah.
So there is a possibility for it, but there has to be some effort from both sides, I think.
And your dissertation is about international trade in Northern Europe, right?
Yes.
In the Baltic,
Yeah.
So how you can interest in Indonesian economic history?
Well, first of all, my interest in the Baltic trade was not so strange, because I am originally from Sweden and I was living in the Netherlands. So I figured I am much better equipped to read Swedish sources than Dutch students, and I'm much better equipped to read Dutch sources than Swedish students. So I have a comparative advantage for studying the relationship between the Netherlands and Sweden in trade, commercial relationship in the 18th century. And that's how I got my PhD topic, and I became a bit of an expert. So it's not a very big topic, but and there are very few people working on it. But then, when I had finished with my dissertation, the then professor in economic history, so was actually my boss, said that why don't you give an exciting seminar on economic history? Well, then you can't start talking about the 18th century and trade in Europe. The students will find that very boring. So he wanted me to choose a more exciting topic for a seminar. He was getting old. He didn't want to change himself, so he wanted me to take care of the change. So I started giving a seminar on the economic aspects of imperialism, and students loved it. They found it very interesting. Everybody was talking about imperialism and colonialism, but very few people were connecting it with the economic aspect. So I gave this seminar for several years, and I had the good fortune that my university, Leiden University, is located only 10 minutes by train from one of the best collections in the world of information about colonial Indonesia, the huge colonial archive
in Den
Haag. So I took the students there, and then of course I supervised them, but at one stage they didn't need any supervision. They knew how to handle the archive themselves. So then I started to do research for myself. Well, I had to be there anyway to keep an eye on them. So I wanted to do some research myself. And then I chose as a topic the economic history of Southeast Kalimantan.
Dayak.
Yeah, between Dayak and Dutch.
Yes.
And many people think that was my dissertation, but it was actually the first book after my PhD dissertation. And incidentally, this book appeared in 1988, and in 2012, after almost 25 years, it was translated into Bahasa Indonesia, and I went on a marketing tour to South and East Kalimantan.
Yeah.
That was one of the few times in my life when I felt like a celebrity. Because there were a lot of people interested in this topic. I think it was only because the book was about Kalimantan.
Yeah.
I don't know if they actually read it.
Oh my God.
I doubt it very much, but that is how I got into Indonesian economic history, and at about the same time, we got a professor at Leiden University in Indonesian history. It was called Kees Vasseur.
Oh, Kees Vasseur, yes.
Yeah. And he said, I'm very glad that you are here, he said to me, because I'm not at all interested in economics, but I realized that economic history is important. So I can take care of a political history of Indonesia, and you will take care of the economic history of Indonesia. So we had a kind of division of labor, and at one stage, and that was already at the end of the 1990s, then I was asked by this professor, so why don't you come and work for half-time in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies, where he was working. So that before that I had a full-time appointment in the history department, but then I got two half-time jobs. One in the history department still, teaching economic history, and one in the Indonesian Studies Department, teaching primarily economic history, but actually also some political history, because the professor was about to retire. And that was very rewarding. It was very interesting to work in two departments, although the colleagues often forgot that I had an appointment for 50%, and they thought I was a full-time staff member in both departments. But at that time, in the 1990s, there was also a very important initiative taken to promote Indonesian economic history, and in the form of a succession of international conferences, which started in Jakarta, next one was in Canberra, and the third one was in Amsterdam. Yes. And that was actually to begin Indonesian economic history as a field of study in Indonesia. And then that also resulted in a textbook written by Patek Janvi and myself and two other persons.
Yeah, I know that.
Unfortunately, that textbook is not available in Bahasa Indonesia. It's only available in English, and as many English books, it's far too expensive for most students. Yeah. But I have seen that there are many copies of it. Yeah. So clandestine copies circulating.
But I have the book conference, the conference book. It is in Jakarta.
Yeah.
The title is Modern Economy, Indonesia Modern Sejarah Ekonomi Modern Indonesia.
Yeah. So that the new challenges in the modern economic history of Indonesia, and that is precisely to show that this is something new. And it was the very first time, that conference in Jakarta in 1991, the very first time that a conference on Indonesian economic history was held in Indonesia. And it was sponsored by LIPI.
Yes, LIPI.
And actually Patek Janvi was a very important person behind the scenes of organizing.
And Pak Sumitro.
Pak Sumitro was also very important. He was keynote speaker and supporting the Indonesian participants.
So, could you tell me how you make relation with Indonesian scholar at first, with Pak Sumitro?
Well, actually, much of it was through Patek Janvi. he was my first contact in Indonesia, and I got his. I met him at a conference in the Netherlands, and then I told him that I'm working in Kalimantan and I'm intending to visit Kalimantan, and then he said, "Well, you'll be coming from Jakarta, so you must come to my office." Yeah. He's a very efficient man, because when I came to his office, he said that you're going to Kalimantan. Well, my brother-in-law in Kalimantan just passed away, but can you give condolences to his wife? So I was in that way. I was even involved in his personal life, and then I got into the habit of visiting him every time I came to Jakarta. I got to know his wife and his son. His son is, by the way, a quite successful singer.
Yeah.
And Marcel T.
Marcel T.
Yeah, he has brought out a number of very nice CDs. Yeah. And he is also working as a journalist for the Jakarta Globe.
Solo singer?
No, he has a band.
Has band.
Yeah, but I know him from when he was a young boy. So. Yeah. And Pate introduced me to a lot of people. He introduced me to Pa Sumitro, to Pa Durojatun, and I went to various universities throughout Indonesia. And, like Hasanuddin in Makassar, and Andalas in Padang, Srivijaya in Palembang, and at each place I had letters of recommendation from Pate. And I had already met with Pajoko Suryo. Pajoko Suryo and Pasatono were my first contacts here in Yogyakarta. And then, of course, at one time, I made a very important contact here in Yogyakarta, which was Pa Bambang. And we first time we met was when I was the external examiner for his PhD.
Yeah. In London.
In London, yes. At the University of London.
Yes.
And then I invited him to join a conference in Australia, the second conference in the succession of 3 conferences. And then we made plans for further promoting the field of Indonesian economic history in Indonesia, which was all the time supported in the background by Pajoko. Yeah, Pajoko Suryo. And in 1995, we had the first so-called summer school. The summer school may be a bit of a funny name. It's a bit Eurocentric because it was in our summer. Yeah. And I was teaching it together with a younger colleague called Vincent Hauben.
Yeah, Vincent Hauben.
Yeah, who later became a professor in Germany.
Yes, in Hamburg.
Well, no, not in Hamburg. He was in Passau, very obscure university, and then he went to the Humboldt University in Berlin, which is very famous. And we were teaching this course, this so-called summer course, for the first time in 1995 for about 20 students, including a couple of Dutch students. And it was a very successful group. Several of them have become Guru Besar since then. And the youngest participant was Margono.
Yes.
Yeah. But for instance, Pasinggi, who is a professor of maritime history
in Undip,
yes. He was one of the participants. And the participants in the course were selected by Pa Bambang. So he made sure that, first of all, that it was a selection of good people, very good students, and also, and I think that was very wise of him, that there were people from all parts of Indonesia. It would have been so easy to only choose students from UGM.
Yeah.
But he chose people from Undip, from Jakarta, even from Aceh and from Makassar. And so he actually really tried to make it a national event. Mm. And this summer course, as it still was called, was repeated in 1996 and in 1997. So just a couple of weeks before the Asian crisis hit Indonesia in 1997, we had a very pleasant time with the course here in Yogyakarta.
So, you ever said that you want to make a comprehensive book about Indonesian economic history? Mm-hmm. That is nowadays have fulfilled?
There have been several conferences on Indonesian economic history. There was one in 1999 to try out the textbook. We had written the manuscript, but we wanted to have feedback from Indonesian historians. And I have also organized a conference in about, I think it was around 2008 with participants from Indonesia and also from Australia, a conference on the Indonesian economy under the Orde Lama, because that has not been studied very well. Well, fortunately, there are people like Mas Abi who have been doing a very important work on the Orde Lama, but the economy of Orde Lama is actually a bit understudied. So most people say that it was a bad time for economics, but that's part of the Orde Baru propaganda of contrasting everything which was good under Suharto with everything that was bad under Sukarno. It was bad at the end, but it was not all the time bad under Sukarno. So I organized several conferences in Leiden, and now I have a project concerning a research project concerning foreign capital and colonial development. Actually, the idea of what was the contribution, what was the impact of Dutch foreign investment in colonial Indonesia and also immediately afterwards in the 1950s. And this was this was discussed at in some detail at a conference in Leiden in December 2014, which happened to be at the same time the event to mark my retirement as a teacher at Leiden University. But this project is now nearing its end, so we want to have another conference, and we want to have it here in Yogyakarta. So I've already asked Mas Margono and Pak Bambang about it, and they sounded very enthusiastic.
Yes. Okay, Pak Thomas, I want to ask about the prospect. What the prospect of Indonesian economic history in the future? Is there any topic, theme, approach, or period that should be researched?
Well, there is still a lot of work to be done, and I think much has happened in Indonesian economic history in the last 25 years since this whole process began. In 2010, there was a one-day conference here in the Netherlands, here in Yogyakarta, on the occasion of the 75th birthday of Pathet Janvi. And it was great fun because we had managed to keep it secret from him. He didn't know that the conference was going to be about his birthday. And he was given a book, and one of the first participants in the summer course in 1995 man who is now a lecturer at the University of Jember. Yeah, and Naviento is his name. He graduated from here, and he wrote a historiographical survey of what had happened in economic history since 1990. And it's really impressive of how much has been done between 1990 and 2010. And so I think that it has come a long way, and there is still much to be done. In particular, I think about Vaudrelama. And still, well, about the colonial period, there are very few people in the Netherlands who work on the colonial period. And there's a great wealth of material. And the only thing is that the Indonesian students who want to use that material, they must be able to read Dutch. Yeah. And that is what several other people, of the staff members at this department, have been learning and have become very proficient in reading the Dutch archival material and writing about the colonial period.
Okay, Pak Thomas. Besides your economic history book, you also write some novel.
Yes, yeah. Well, that is an old hobby of mine. Actually, already when I was a student, I was writing novels. Simply because I like fiction. I like to read, and I like to write, and I get nice ideas. But I think that my novels from my student years, well, they were not really worth publishing because they were just tryouts and were not so good. And then for quite a few years, I didn't write any novels at all. Well, partly because I was working on my PhD, and the PhD dissertation had the first priority. Another reason was that I was living in the Netherlands. I was using Dutch all the time, but my Dutch was still not enough to write novels. Yes. And then about 20 years ago, then all of a sudden I got some new ideas, and then I started to write novels again. And I have
the Jonge Docent.
Yeah, the Jonge Docent. Yeah. Actually, the first one is the Young Traveler, the Jonge Reiziger.
Yeah,
yeah. So it's actually it's a series of 3 novels about a young Dutchman and student at Leiden University, who gets in the first book he is a student of Leiden University, and the second one he's a PhD candidate, and in the third one he's teaching at the university. And he gets his PhD but it was great fun to write, and they have received some attention. It's not like a bestseller, but there is a group of people of quite devoted readers, and one of the things is also that it wasn't so difficult for me to get the book published, but the marketing is very difficult. Yeah. There is an enormous competition if you publish fiction, and the topic should really be something extremely exciting. Then you can or something completely new, like J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter was completely new. But you've seen that since then. There's a whole generation of novels in the same vein, and. When I finished these 3 books, I wrote a 4th novel about which has not been translated into English. It's called Sharp Colors.
Sharp Colors.
Yeah, and that's about a teenage boy who is half Dutch and half American.
of American.
Yeah, so much of it is actually taking place in the United States. And I'm here, there in that book. I am using my experience from my own student days in the United States. And there was quite a bit of a different book there, because it's not about university life, not so much, and it's more psychological. Yeah. And now I'm writing a new novel, which is actually being published on my website. So it's being published in the form of episodes. So every week there is a new episode, and the novel is called "The Duel of the Vikings."
Yeah.
And so, well, it's simply something which I like very much, and it's a good time to a good way to spend your spare time.
Yeah. So why you don't write historical novel Indonesia?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. That
about agriculture, about what?
Yeah, well, that is a possibility, but I used to think that either you are a historian or a writer, and to mix the two, that is a bit dangerous. Yes. But still, not so long ago, I did write a short story. It was published, a short story on Swedish history. That was actually a mixture of things which I found in the archive and things which I simply made up. But Indonesian history offers much opportunities for interesting fiction. Yeah. And you have to add some more spectacular details.
Yeah. But writing that novel for economic historian, in my thought, is very, very, very wonderful. With someone who get busy with number and statistics. Yeah.
Well, maybe that is one reason why I was so attracted by fiction, because my profession as an economist, as an economic historian, it keeps me away from people and from emotions and feelings, and a novel gives the opportunity to do so. Yeah, to get into that.
Okay, so Pak Thomas, thank you for an interesting interview.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and thank you for receiving me so well again in Yogyakarta. So I'll surely come back here.